everyone, and welcome to the Directors Club podcast. And, just as an anniversary episode dropped, a momentous occasion, like we discussed in that episode, it was officially episode 200, but we've done 100 bonus episodes along the way. So technically it was episode 300 if you want to get, technical about it. But I had an epiphany for the first bonus episode of May, because we're mainly just doing those again for this month as opposed to an official director. But yet at the same time, I've got an official director, writer, editor, podcaster extraordinaire on the show. He's a perfect guest to contact and invite back, because the reason I started podcasting in the first place was because, well, over a decade now, I heard this show called Film Junk randomly when I was searching for movie podcasts to listen to at a boring day job I had downtown. And I just loaded up on episodes into my iPod, which is now discontinued apparently. But little did I know that discovering Film Junk would kind of change my trajectory. And one of the hosts in particular felt like a brother from another mother due to his taste in films, also his sense of humor, and weird, wild adventures involving trips to the doctor. I'm, of course, talking about the one and only Cheel, who is a terrific filmmaker, and Patrick and I spoke very early on for the episodes we did on Errol Morris and John Carpenter. But he's back with the second iteration of his amazing series that's playing on Shudder, Cursed Films. We're going to talk about all that and more. Welcome back to the show, a real hero and one of the most talented human beings I know, Cheel.
Definitely hero material. Thank you for having me, Jim. It's been a while.
It has
been a while.
Thank you. You know I wanted that. All right.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it has been a while. I've had the pleasure of talking with Frank and Sean. Oh, gosh, what did we do? We did what was the last one? Oh, we did David O. Russell and the Zucker brothers, or the Zucker team at one point. But we'll have to get you back on maybe next year if you have time for an official director again, because those episodes are always a treat.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But I'm hoping you can hear this, but of course I'm using my Rodecaster Pro, and I have to do something in your honor, in your spirit, and something, pay tribute, pay homage to what you do with this wacky sound pads thing. It will not be nearly as graceful as what you do. This is more of like a ridiculous mashup of sorts. Let's see if this works.
Let me hear it.
You are a hero, a genuine hero.
Fuck. Like, it's so uninspired.
Is there a weird vibe going on tonight? What's going on?
What year is this?
Who cares?
I feel your presence amongst us.
You are a hero, a genuine hero.
Okay, that's enough.
Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
The ghost drop that was very nice. I always like to hear ghost being used in some sort of soundboard drops. But yeah, the Rodecaster Pro, it's a beautiful thing.
It is. It's so much fun, and it's hard to know which sound clips to put in there sometimes. And I just kind of I'm just randomly put things in there. I don't even know if they're gonna fit in the context of our conversation, and obviously I'm not going to do what you do and just drop them in as you're talking. But
feel free. I probably deserve it.
We can always just throw in Frank here.
Is there a weird vibe going on tonight? What's going on?
That was actually just for the last episode. Oh boy. Yeah. No, but keeping in spirit with the way you approach interviews, I more or less want to have a general conversation about your smash hit, your latest endeavor, the Cursed Films 2. Obviously, I was a huge fan of the first go around with Cursed Films, and now it's I'm pretty floored by what you've accomplished with this series in general. And it's
thank you.
And it feels like like an encapsulation of the things that you find interesting about film and the stories and behind the scenes things and theories, and like it feels totally you, and and yet you're also doing these incredible interviews with a lot of amazing talent. When I first started watching it, I thought, like, this is kind of an interesting integration of Errol Morris and someone like Rodney Asher, who did, Rootin' Through 37. And, and mixed with your terrific editing skills, of course. I'm just wondering, like, how does this all start, really? Because, with a feature film, obviously you have a screenplay, you have some blueprints to go off of, and like an outline or something. But, like, do you sort of map out a plan, or do you really just find the story later on after you've done all the filming and you're editing it all together? I'm sort of curious about, like, how the initial process begins.
Well, I like to be prepared, but I don't like to be over prepared, because I think the most fun is finding stories while we're traveling. We did a lot of filming for this season, a lot more than the first season, and we would always be looking for new stories and new people to reach out to. And a good example is Scott Michaels, who's the Helter Skelter tour guide. He runs the Dearly Departed tours. He's in our Rosemary's Baby episode. And he was like an addition while we were in LA. I was just in the hotel room and, doing some searching around on the internet, on YouTube specifically, I think I was just looking at some of the locations that we were going to visit, and came across one of his videos and immediately contacted my producer and said, let's try to reach out to this guy, because I think he could be interesting. And I was on the phone with him the next day, and then we were filming with him the day after that. So, there's those elements. There are those elements that are not planned, and sometimes that takes the story in a different direction as well. Mm-hmm. But the very basic planning is just, what films we're covering, what the key story points are in terms of the legends and rumors surrounding the making of the film, and then just trying to put together a list of interesting interview subjects, some who worked on the film, and maybe some who might be a unique voice outside of the sphere of the film that could kind of comment on its legacy, and always kind of just trying to keep it character focused. By character, I mean interview subject, making sure that we're getting unique voices and meeting people that are intriguing and interesting to listen to and to watch. And I think that's kind of what hopefully separates this show out from other, like E! True Hollywood Story or shows that kind of are purely focused on trying to create some sensation around the stories connected to the films.
Yeah, that's something I've struggled with a lot of sort of docudramas. I mean, most of them are about serial killers, like the whole true crime wave. I mean, it could be, with the story. I mean, this probably goes all the way back to something that you recently brought up on the show, was I Know My First Name is Steven, which I saw pretty, I think I even saw the premiere with my mom, and it pretty much scarred me for life. And so I had to catch up with Captive Audience when you brought that up. And as I was watching it, I was having like a little bit of a issue with the decision they make with the third episode. Like the focus changed, and it makes sense why, but it felt, I don't want to say exploitive, but like sensationalizing it to some degree. That was a series that I thought, like, yeah, this is almost like a question of ethics to some degree about, trying to figure out the best way to put it. But like, does it hurt or help to tell that story about this particular? And I don't want to spoil it either.
Yeah. I think it's always a challenging conversation, and I don't have any like. I try to approach all of our subjects with a consideration towards all of those concerns. Not being exploitative and not being sensational. And I think the thing that I just try to focus on is providing context. I think when things feel exploitative, it's when they're being used to elicit a reaction without any context. Yeah. So as much as I love the show Cops, you don't know anything about the people who are being stopped by the police. You don't know their history, and you don't even know what happens to them after that segment ends. It's just like a passerby seeing this moment in this person's life where they're having this this event happen, and that to me that feels a bit exploitative. So I just want to make sure that whenever we deal with a subject or a person that feels like, this could be something that could very easily fall into a sensational exploitative trap, I try to just counterbalance that with context. But
you do.
It's also a subjective thing. Like there's this series is weirdly controversial for a lot of people, and I feel like for some people there's just no there's just this opinion that a camera should not be focused on certain things, and I don't share that opinion. I just feel like you have to do it with empathy and with the intent to provide context.
Yeah, no, and you definitely do that. It was just something like, I find it interesting too, both with Captive Audience and now this new HBO Max. Well, it's obviously fictionalized, or not fictionalized, but dramatic. The Staircase, which was a huge hit. Everybody knew about this case because of the Netflix show, or you think of something like The Jinx, and I like that a lot of filmmakers are asking these questions, whether this is a good thing or not, or, the effect that it's having on our collective psyche in a way. I mean, certainly that's what Captive Audience, I think, set out to do with, obviously what happened to this family as a result of all this media coverage surrounding them. And clearly it caused tremendous amounts of PTSD in nearly everyone. And did that, in effect, create essentially another monster of some kind, I'll say, without spoiling what happens in the third episode. And to me, watching that, I thought, well, this is really thoughtful, and there's a lot of empathy here, for sure. But I also wonder, do we need these stories to be told because that's exactly what certain people wanted, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or do we need another iteration of The Staircase, starring Hollywood stars or whatever? It's those types of questions I ask about when, approaching docudramas or things like this.
Yeah. Well, I actually just rewatched all of The Staircase.
Oh, wow.
And it was interesting revisiting it because, it landed on Netflix in 2018, but the original first 7 episodes, I think, aired in 2004 on, I think, the Sundance Channel. And so it's been around for a while. So it predates the true crime craze by a number of years. And watching it now, after having seen a number of true crime shows within the last 5 years, it's very different. It's, for one, it feels like there aren't many doc series that are in the moment, cinema verite sort of. We're covering a trial that's ongoing, and we're seeing the immediate results of every single discovery or decision. It's always reflective and looking back at a story, and it's always talking head interviews, and because it's just tough, I think, to land in the middle of a story that's ongoing or has just begun, which is what makes The Staircase so interesting. But also the way the episodes end really stood out to me on this rewatch, because they don't end in cliffhangers. I always remembered thinking like they did, but for example, the whole discovery of the blowpoke and all of the other things that come up. Germany, all the details about Germany, it usually happens in the first act of the following episode. So
Right.
the idea of that sort of like, cliffhanger driven, keeping you wrapped in the algorithm and just, constantly hitting next because you need to know where the story goes, isn't really there. So that feels like something that I understand why these shows feel that it's necessary to have these cliffhangers. They want to keep people engaged, but that does feel a little like you're turning something very dark into entertainment.
Yeah. That's why I don't know how I feel about, I do like the filmmaker Antonio Campos and certainly the cast involved with the staircase. And I was just curious how they're going to tackle this when we already know pretty much everything. And would it be compelling on its own? And you're right that at least the 3 episodes I've seen, they kind of do end with cliffhangers because they know that's what hooks people in. But
yeah, and I think that's just especially with the true crime doc world, the Jinx kind of, I think, had I guess you could say maybe negative effect in that every show now people want some major revelation. Like it can't just be about the people who were caught up in some horrible tragedy and trying to like figure out what that means and how that changes someone and how you relate to it or whatever. It has to have some hook. And if it doesn't end on some twist or some reveal, then it's not a satisfying ending. And I feel like that came from the Jinx directly. It kind of set the bar for like, if you want to have a hit true crime show, you have to have someone, admitting guilt on a hot mic. So even that, that has an effect on both the audience and the filmmakers, because the audience is the one that suddenly needs that sort of, they want that level of entertainment, and the filmmakers want to provide that to them. So what are the filmmakers doing to try and get to that level, to satisfy the audience? And I think that's where it can get kind of tricky, ethically, and
yeah. And I mean, you mentioned that certainly Cursed Films has been considered a little controversial by some people. I would think that the Rosemary's Baby episode, I mean, to me, it was interesting in how much it really sums up the paranoia and all that was going on culturally surrounding that era, the late 60s, and all the devastating things that happened, particularly the Manson murders. It's almost like a perfect episode to watch after Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But yeah, you probably have to be thoughtful and consider Mia Farrow in all of this and what she's been through recently with that, the Woody Allen. Another series that played, I believe, on HBO Max that I felt uncomfortable and questioning whether it was good or not to watch. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, yeah. I think you probably have to sit down and almost think about your approach to something like Rosemary's Baby, and and how you're going to tell that story and how much you're going to involve Mia Farrow and certainly all the things that have happened to her personally.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of my approach to these episodes is kind of letting the subjects guide the conversation, obviously, but also the tone. So if and of course we choose a number of these subjects to be in the show. So there's an editorial choice to have certain voices represented and others not. Sometimes not by our choice, just we can't get someone to be in the episode, but that's a very important thing. And with the Rosemary's Baby episode, I think more so than the Mia Farrow thing, the Polanski,
sure,
that whole element is something that going into it we all knew would be a controversial thing, even if, I know there are some people who think that by not including that, it's kind of like avoiding some subject. It's not avoiding it. It's purposefully leaving it out so that I think it's almost more powerful than if we put a card or something, or like had a voice for 30 seconds referring to what happened, which would then also just weirdly suggest we're connecting a statutory rape of a minor to a curse,
Yeah, that's tricky.
And also the fact that the episode is very much set in 68 and 69. It's very much about 68 and 69. The only real, exception to that is Victoria Vetri catching up with her and things that happened afterwards. But it still connects back to the paranoia of the late 60s that stuck with her. So, but a lot of people, I think, especially with this series, I think there's a lot of people that are tuning in for information, for trivia, and not so much for subtext or for a character or for the themes or whatever. So I could, try to reply to someone on whatever, Twitter or wherever, and explain to them the intentions of certain things that they felt were questionable. And those intentions would come from a place of the consideration of the filmmaking and the storytelling. And I think for a lot of people, documentaries just don't fall in that zone. I think they're information delivery devices for a lot of people. And I think the idea of a documentary using something like metaphor or subtext or whatever tools that scripted filmmakers use, that doesn't really resonate, I think, with some people. But then on the other hand, it's like, yeah, Polanski wasn't in the episode. And by people commenting on that, there's probably more people talking about like Polanski being this problematic figure than there would be if there was a subtle mention to that in the episode. And even if there was a subtle mention, there would be complaints that there wasn't enough time dedicated to it. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation, but we knew that going into it.
Yeah, you sort of had to prepare for those types of reactions, I would think. And, I certainly, like, that's the thing too, is like, I feel like people approach documentaries as, like you said, information dumps in a way that's like a Wikipedia entry, done visually, and you don't do that at all. And I think that's what makes, you make it cinematic, you make it entertaining and yet engaging, but also you learn something as you're watching the episodes. I thought even with the Wizard of Oz episode, I thought it was interesting to hear Steve Rash, director of Under the Rainbow, sort of go back and realize that his work doesn't hold up, like it's like he's reckoning with the past and kind of going, oh no, maybe I didn't do such a great job, or I wasn't good in representing little people or things like that. I think, and it also that nicely ties into how some of the actors felt, in light of what's happened with Cannibal Holocaust too. I think that sort of ties it all together.
Yeah, I think, Steve Rash is a great example of that sort of finding the story both in the field and in the edit, because we were just going to talk to him about Under the Rainbow as a curiosity that perpetuated the drunk munchkin orgy myth. But, we showed up, and he and his wife, who also worked on the film, had watched it, I believe the day before or that morning, and they hadn't seen it in 20 years, and that was their reaction. So it was like a completely different interview. The interview, there was never any thought that the interview would be Steve essentially apologizing for that film. He just felt he needed to do it because they were surprised at how out of touch it was. And his wife said she was devastated watching it, and she was trying to just didn't want it. She said it was the worst day of the year or whatever. So they were wanting to use it as an opportunity to acknowledge, those things in that film. And so when that happens, and then it's like, okay, this interview is completely different and serves a totally different purpose. And what is that purpose? So, in the edit, having Steve Rash reckoning with the past in surrounding his film, which is mostly forgettable. Yeah, if not completely forgettable. Blip in early 80s cinema, putting that right up against Oz historians attempting to rationalize some of the stuff that happened on the set of Oz, in particular the slap of Judy Garland. I think that suddenly creates an interesting contrast. And then it's like, okay, a lot of this episode is about reckoning with the past, and the idea of things have changed, but where is that line in terms of like still appreciating something for what it was, and understanding that it was a different time back then, but also acknowledging that it was still problematic. And that's the kind of like thematic connections that I love discovering, or even sometimes planning for, but to be honest, usually just kind of discovering. But also the kind of thing, again, getting back to what we were just talking about, that I think for some people just kind of goes over their heads because they're just looking at the information and not how the information informs counterpoints, or like how the information is kind of placed against each other to create some other conversation that might be subtextual but is there. So being upset about a bunch of white men seemingly downplaying Victor Fleming slapping Judy Garland, that's the point.
Yeah.
That's in there for a reason. But it's weird with this show because it's always the title is something we are always up against, whether it be narrowing the potential for films that we can cover because it doesn't slot into the ideal cursed film definition, or even just in approaching subjects, especially on the first season, asking them to be in something called cursed films to talk about something that might be sensitive is a bit of a challenge. So I think that doesn't do us any favors, that it's a bit of a bait and switch. Like there's already an expectation when a lot of people go into the series that it's going to be exploitative and sensational. So I think it's read by some people, read it as that on the surface. And the challenge is trying to acknowledge that that's not what it is, enough that they understand, but then not also just completely spelling it out for people. I still want it to be somewhat like engaging, where it's just not all laid out for you.
Yeah, no. And you have a very thoughtful and considerate approach. It's like, I was even thinking, oh no, I mean, even with going back to the first series with Poltergeist, and it's so sad what happened to Heather O'Rourke that it actually, it's similar to with, I guess it's not similar, but I think it's because I saw both of these films when I was younger. Savannah Smiles, the lead actress of Savannah Smiles, also died very young, very different circumstances, granted. But I just remember being really like affected by losing Heather O'Rourke because I grew up watching Poltergeist. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to make me all sad and everything. And it certainly does. But I mean, in a way that I think you're very compassionate in your approach, and certainly involving the interview of Gary Sherman, who that's a phenomenal director, very underrated. Somebody that comes from Chicago, and I've sung the praises of Dead and Buried a lot on the podcast. And I thought that interview really did showcase that you're not just, let's sensationalize the death of and tie it into this, idea of what a curse is, and all these terrible things happen after, both on set and then afterwards. No, I think you did it the right way by actually talking to different people about their perspectives and letting them have their say.
I'm glad you feel that way. I mean, I think the big important distinction is that the show Cursed Films isn't claiming any of these films are cursed.
Right.
It's about people who are claiming these films are cursed, or trying to dispel this idea that they're cursed.
Yeah.
And that's the key. If there's, I think the problem with some of the True Hollywood type of shows is that they go in with a very focused intention in terms of how spooky they want something to be, or how, they just really leaning into certain supernatural things, or, whatever it might be. With this show, it's completely up to the subject what they want to talk about and how they want to talk about it. And Gary Sherman, maybe if it was a more soundbitey interview and we were, wanting him to play up the weirdness of things that have happened on the Poltergeist 3 set or something.
Yeah.
That interview could have gone a completely different way, but it was in his hands, and that's where he took it. And I go along with him and just kind of, try to bring that out of him. And more often than not, that's, I think, a successful approach.
It's clear that he wrestled certainly with even completing Poltergeist 3.
Yeah. And, those are the kinds of interviews that are the best, where it's just asking someone to speak openly, like Craig Reardon in the same episode, wanting to have his say in terms of people connecting the death of those girls to the use of real bones on the set. Getting that sort of honesty from him, that he was on the True Hollywood Poltergeist episode, and that almost led to him not doing our show because he didn't want to be fucked over again by having his comments contextualized in the way that they were in that episode. So it was very much like, well, this is the chance to just kind of provide the appropriate context. Because
do it
the
right.
show's called the show's called Cursed Films, but we're not perpetuating or pushing this idea. It's about why people think they're cursed, and why the legends in some cases have kind of outlasted the films themselves.
Yeah, I imagine working on all this. I mean, did it change the way you think about what a curse is and what it means to be cursed? Because a lot of people who have a string of bad luck or a lot of bad things happen to them in life often casually say, "I think I'm cursed." Yeah,
I mean, I think that's when I think of the title Cursed Films, that's what I think about. Just like the various ways in which that word can be used to describe a situation that seems to be going completely wrong, and depending on the details connected to that circumstance, the more superstitious person might start thinking it could be something supernatural. But there's also the other side where it's just, a lot of bad planning, like the Serpent in the Rainbow episode. There is the voodoo element, where there was this sort of aura being in Haiti and going to these ceremonies and kind of being in the middle of all of this talk of voodoo. But really, it was about like the naivete and the hubris to think that you could bring an American film crew to Haiti and film there, assuming that it's going to be easy peasy. You're not going to have any sort of negative impact on the community or the culture. So there are many definitions there, but when talking about the idea of a curse in the, I guess, traditional sense, it is interesting to think about. While I don't believe in curses necessarily, I also kind of do because of other people believing in them. So if someone believes that they've been cursed, we get into this a little bit in I think the Poltergeist episode, but if someone's superstitious and they think that they've been cursed, or they, with sports, it's a huge thing with baseball players and like wearing a lucky ring or a lucky hat or whatever it might be. And even if it's just a superstitious thing, if they realize they don't have their lucky hat, that they forgot it, it could affect the way that they play, because it's just their belief in that thing being important to their performance will shake them and will have an effect on their performance. So that is a curse, like it's not, it's not something that, is like, I think you just have to believe that you are cursed and believe in curses in order to be cursed. Because the more you believe, the more likely you'll just it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you'll kind of fall into allowing things to kind of fall apart because you think you've been set on this dark path.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I always think about the placebo effect and confirmation bias, and like you mentioned, self-fulfilling prophecy and all these things. Like, are we creating, because some people do believe that, like the power of positive thinking, right? Like, if you believe in good things will happen to you, then guess what? Good things will happen to you. And I don't know, it's when you've had a string of bad things happen, it's hard to feel encouraged, like, oh, I'll just think positive thoughts, and that'll solve everything.
I mean, even that, it's interesting because I don't really believe that, but just like the curse thing, I do believe that if someone does believe that, then maybe their positive outlook will be affected, and they might start, trying a little harder to make a change in their life, or they might start, it might inspire something. I don't think I believe in something having a direct effect in a sort of like, I don't know, like a supernatural way, or however you would put it. But I think psychologically there could be a positive effect in that way. And that's, a lot of the interesting conversations, especially in the first season, that I was able to have with a lot of cool people like Mitch Horowitz, who's very much, a cult historian, and believes a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, but in a very kind of rational way. That, out of everyone that I spoke to that was on the side of kind of being a believer, he's the one that was the most interesting, because just the way that he discusses these things, it just feels like it comes from a place of being both educated in the subject matter, but also having kind of a very unique perspective and being open to the idea of, well, this might not be a real thing in the way that people think about it traditionally, but it has become real because of that way people think about it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff surrounding curses, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I'm always interested in like the psychological effects, having studied psychology in particular, but I mean, like, do I have, anxiety and or depression because I watch so many horror films? Probably not. It just, there's like, some people believe that, though. Some people believe like, if you're raised on a certain diet of culture, that it's going to eventually get to you somehow psychologically. And watching something like this too really made me think about the actors in all of this, like someone like Bill Pullman. Like, I can't stand watching the buried alive sequence in Serpent the Rainbow, because I can't, like, the idea of being trapped in a confined space really freaks me out. I don't ever want to be on an elevator if it won't work. That's a terrifying notion, but certainly being buried alive is even worse, because obviously you can't breathe and you're stuck in a certain pattern and you can't move and you can't get your way out of there. So that whole thing, and certainly when that happens in Kill Bill Volume 2, I can't watch that. I found it really interesting to hear from someone, an actor I've really admired for a long time, Bill Pullman, and like his kind of out of body experience that he talked about or something like that. That was really, that was a fascinating interview, and obvious for a lot of reasons, of course.
Yeah, he was great. Very nice, and just everything you would hope that Bill Pullman would be, he is. At least in the time that I met him. And that story, it's interesting because in the show, he says he's not really comfortable talking about it. And in the interview, at that point, I just kind of moved on and was like, that's okay. We can, you can talk generally, or we can, whatever you're comfortable with. And he made a comment about us being Canadian and polite. And then 2 questions later, I circled back to it, and I was just like, Bill, I got to ask you, what is this thing that you were talking about? And he opened up about it, and I think he was still a bit, guarded or protecting a little bit of the detail of what happened, but it just sounds like he had a bit of an epiphany or something, or just an experience that opened his mind to things that he hadn't previously considered. And it feels like a lot of people on the crew had similar experiences. I know David Ladd as well left that film shoot with a kind of interest in spirituality that wasn't there before, and it informed certain aspects of his life. So yeah, I mean, it's not all of the episodes, even though there are things in that episode surrounding the making of that film that are very questionable and not to overuse the word, but problematic. But there's also, I think with that episode in particular, a sort of positive side to it as well, at least in terms of the bonding of this crew and them going through this experience and coming out the other end with maybe a bit more of a respect for how their what they set out to do could result in negative consequences because maybe they were being too cavalier or too naive. So I think that story is a great one as sort of a bit of a change of pace, as being like an adventure story of a bunch of young people led by Wes Craven going to Haiti and having this wild experience.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to point that out, because, we don't want people to think it's all about like, all these horrible things that happened afterwards. No, there's, you mentioned the sort of communal and collective gathering that happens when you're making a film. And if you have an experience together that you can all share, and it sort of bonds you all together. I imagine that happens with your crew, even just putting this entire process together from pre-production to post-production. I think it's important to highlight others that have helped you along the way in this process too. And I think that's like, even if not everything goes right, you can focus on the positive and certainly be grateful for. Because this is a tricky time. I mean, a lot of movies are still getting made, even though I know we're trying to say like, the pandemic it's coming to an end. It's going to be an endemic and all this. I don't know. It must have been challenging to film during COVID, and certainly traveling the way you did.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it made us take for granted the first season where we could travel unencumbered and enter people's homes without thinking twice about it. And, there were a number of situations this season where we had to film interviews outside when we might not have done that. It's always more of a challenge filming outside, especially when you end up under a flight path. And that was what it was. I just wanted to make, I didn't want to feel that in the show. Like I didn't want to do Zoom interviews or, kind of let's embrace the COVID thing and have really make a point of people taking their masks off before interviews or doing interviews via Zoom or whatever it might be. We just wanted to make the show as though it was made not during a pandemic. All of that was behind the scenes. It was just a lot of, it was a logistical nightmare in many ways, the travel for this season, especially considering this season we traveled internationally and went to Estonia and went to Ukraine and went to Rome. Those were, it happened. We made it work. Brian, my producer, did a really great job at, knowing what papers we had to have filled out. And, but even then there were things that were changing almost daily. When we were in Rome, we were supposed to fly from Rome to LA. And the day before, when the Biden administration took over, they changed a rule and decided you couldn't fly from the EU directly to the States. And that happened the day before we were supposed to fly out. So wow. We had to, and we didn't learn that until we were getting our tickets, an hour and a half, 2 hours before our flight. So that was stressful, especially seeing as at the time there was a weird rule in Italy. We were in Rome and that you could stay there 120 hours before having to quarantine for 2 weeks. So we were specifically flying out at a time just like before that 120 hours. So if we missed our flight and we're stuck in Rome, I don't know what the logistics would be like I don't know if you're supposed to self-quarantine or how they would find out what's going on, but we would have had to apparently quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel if we missed that flight. So that would have been a disaster. But we managed to get out of there and we had to fly back to Canada and kind of re-strategize. And every time we ended up back in Canada, that was a 2-week quarantine. So, I think we ended up spending 2.5 months just quarantining in total.
Yeah. Well, it's better to be safe. And, certainly traveling to a place like Chernobyl and I was floored by that episode for a lot of reasons. And certainly it's beautifully shot in that space. And I mean, as you state in the beginning of the episode, this was, all this was before the horrible invasion took place. And, you had to figure out all these certain protocols must have been tricky, but, going to just seeing that there's like an ice cream parlor around that area, yeah. I was just like, really? That's nuts that it's like a tourist attraction the way it is. It's nuts. It's like going to Disney World or something.
It's a weird place. I mean, a lot of the extremely touristy stuff is right outside the exclusion zone. So wow. That's at the checkpoint. It's almost like a border crossing. So before you enter the exclusion zone, all the buses stop and everyone loads up on ice cream or whatever, novelty masks. And then you enter the zone. And while in the zone, it's not as touristy, but we did eat at the power plant, at the Chernobyl power plant in the cantina. And in the entrance at the power plant, there's a little kiosk, that like gift shop.
Right.
So, it is strange. It's a very surreal place, but I am so grateful that we had the chance to go there, especially, in exploring the story connected to Stalker. It was just such a great reason to be in both Tallinn in Estonia and in Ukraine, and will be obviously a experience that I will not forget.
And that's a special film. It's so unique and so deliberately paced in this way that I think can put some people off, but it really envelops you. It's one of those movies that a lot of Tarkovsky's movies I have to be in the right mood for, obviously, with those long takes and everything. But once you're ready for it, like it took me several times to finally sit down and absorb Solaris. And I just, and it was an interesting choice. I thought this was a film that I didn't necessarily equate with, like, a typical horror film like Poltergeist or The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby or something. But you found like a very rich and interesting story to tell. It's, again, like all these play like little short films in of themselves, and in a way that's makes them all distinguishable, but yet truly you at the same time. But that one was
we were
special.
happy to get to do that film. I mean, it's definitely the outlier of the season, and I'm sure a lot of people, if they watched the episode, haven't seen the film. But I feel like, it'd be great if they did watch the film. And from what I've seen, a lot of people have been inspired to check it out after seeing the episode. But I think the story within the episode and the passion expressed by the people who worked on Stalker, and the people who love that film is kind of infectious. So I feel like it works even if you haven't seen the film, but it's definitely, I would suggest people check it out for sure.
Yeah, and the only one of, I think, pretty much your entire series that I'm not a fan of, and I mentioned this to you, was Cannibal Holocaust. It's just not a film I've ever really enjoyed watching for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the animal deaths are awful.
Yeah.
And I understand its place in the world of being a cinephile. I understand, like, clearly it's laying the foundation for things to come, like a lot of the found footage films like Blair Witch, as you mentioned, and do a really great interview with the director of that film. But yeah, I mean, it sort of, again, ties back to what we're talking about with certain thematic elements that are contained within Wizard of Oz, in that the actors themselves, and you lay it out, that the fact that they feel very uncomfortable with a lot of the reactions and certainly what they did making that film. And I think that was really important. And you end the series on a very unexpected note too, with hearing from one of the actors.
Yeah, the whole series ends on one word: awful.
Right.
Which I like.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Cannibal Holocaust. I do see certain aspects of it that are unique and valuable, I suppose, but I don't really like the cannibal subgenre.
Yeah, I'm kind of
find them mostly hard to watch, and I don't know, something about them, they're just kind of gross. Right. On many levels. And Cannibal Holocaust is the same. And it's a challenging episode because we don't want. I think it was the most challenging in terms of conversations with Shudder in regards to what to show.
Yeah.
And where the line is, where it's like, okay, this is too much, but this is also too little. If we're showing too little, then we're not representing what these people are talking about. Like, we need some context. When Francesca is talking about some horrible rape sequence, we need to understand what that is without indulging in it in the way that the film does.
Yeah.
But it's there's just a lot of uncomfortable stuff in there, and not just the animal killings, but the rape scenes, and dealing with the fact that they talk about one of the rape scenes in the film. The actor, in quotes, the performer, was a 14-year-old girl, and this is the person that is the kind of iconic image of this film. This girl mounted on this pole, naked, covered in blood. And after hearing them say she was 14, then it's suddenly like, well, we can't even show the like the thing that's on the poster, the thing that's the most iconic shot of the movie is territory we can't go in because of that fact. And that's the challenge of covering that film, is like there's just so much grotesque stuff connected to it that you have to figure out how much you want to get your own hands dirty in telling that story. And I think, to be honest, with a lot of these things, we do have to get our hands a bit dirty, because there is an element of like when Eugenio in that episode is talking about Cannibal Holocaust being this weird contradiction where it's like telling you, chastising you for enjoying the violence in this film. The theme of it being who are the cannibals, but also providing that violence for you to, and using it as sort of a set piece. There is a subtle element of that with our series, which is like, all of these stories feel really sometimes fun when they're summarized as bullet points on BuzzFeed. But once you actually start talking to the people, they're a little more intense. And I think we have to kind of go down, in some cases, like the Twilight Zone episode. I just feel like there's certain paths we had to go down that maybe not everyone agrees with, but provides the appropriate context for illuminating why these things can be, it can be a problem when you look at some of these stories and just think of them as trivia, or as, notorious, like the notorious scene where this thing happens, and looking at it as though it's like a challenge to watch this thing. And, well, what is the context behind that scene? Like, what was the intent, and what were the people thinking when they made it, and why are we fascinated with it? And the only way to have that conversation is to show parts of that scene, as much as we feel comfortable showing. So it is a bit of a contradiction as well. It's like with all of documentary, the idea of exploitation. Yes, you don't want to be exploitative, but technically everything is exploitative because we're filming and editing these people and putting them on the television. So it's a weird thing.
That's kind of why I had that response, like I said earlier, to the third episode of Captive Audience. And certainly I'll have that response probably anytime there's a true crime story where, I don't know, are we just glorifying? Are we just basically putting this serial killer, like they wanted all this attention, right? So here it is, we're giving it to them. And yet I think, a filmmaker like you is actually treating the subject matter with sensitivity, and not just like, I can't wait to, because even when I was a teenager, I didn't like the Faces of Death movies, or whatever you want to call them, the collection, because it just made me feel gross, and it just made me, well, what's the context? This isn't really a story. It's just a series. I mean, I guess what Mondo Cane was certainly kind of a variation of that, maybe a more artistic approach to that style. But,
with its own problems, I wish we could have done a feature length episode on Cannibal Holocaust. And if we, when I say we could have, Shudder, that option wasn't there, but with the amount of material we had, we could have. But I would have liked to have gotten more into that aspect, the Mondo Cane, and Deodato being inspired by that, and just the weird lines that those films blur with staged scenes, and the idea of the other, and representing other cultures as like a lower form of society, and looking in on this. It very, the way that Cannibal Holocaust kind of, that's an aspect of Cannibal Holocaust as well, a racism.
Oh, sure.
Within there, and even though, again, Deodato says the film is about that racism, it's about colonialism, and it's about all of those things, but he also engages in it as he's criticizing it. And that's a hypocrisy, but I don't think that's it's definitely not the worst that hypocrisy isn't the worst thing about the film, but it is something to acknowledge. But I also think there's a lot of things that are guilty of that. And I'm sure, I think there are probably elements of our show that's guilty of that, because in order to talk about these curses from a analytical sort of perspective or psychological perspective, we have to say what they are. Like we are perpetuating them in some way. We're just trying to provide context.
Yeah. And you do that wonderfully also while creating, and giving us a lot of entertainment. And I think that's important to provide that, like that nice balance of sensitive approach to the material. But at the end of the day, it's also endlessly enjoyable to watch too. There's never like a time where I'm like, oh, okay, let's move on. I think the way it's paced, it's all perfectly done. And it's just really interesting to think about, how does a filmmaker, how does an actor reframe or go back and look at what they've done, and how has it affected them? How has it affected the audience? And now on another level, how has it affected you to cover all of this too at the same time? There's a lot of layers.
Yeah. And it's also nice to be talking to a lot of people who worked on these films that maybe don't get to speak about having worked on these films, or at least in the context that we're talking to them about. I think that's a great part of it as well. Like David Anderson in the Serpent and the Rainbow episode, I'm sure he's done a number of interviews. His dad has done a number of interviews. His dad was in our Crow episode, and I'm sure they've done a lot of talking about makeup effects and working on these shows, but maybe not from such a sort of personal, honest perspective. And I hope and I think you can kind of sense that,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping when you watch the shows that we're seeing people being very candid and open, and, maybe we're getting a glimpse into a moment that we haven't seen before with some of these people.
Yeah. And I think it's like you're mentioning, you do give, the time and the space for people, like you said, that don't always get to have these conversations or talk about what they've been through. It's not like those like the music documentaries where it's like, just like Dave Grohl is going to tell you about how great this thing is, right? Or this record or this studio or something. You're always going to see like Dave Grohl, or for some reason, Jason Schwartzman or something. It's like the expected, familiar talking heads that show up in a lot of these sort of celebratory documentaries, I think kind of make me roll my eyes. So I think your approach is a lot better, to be honest.
Well, I hope that's what kind of makes them feel more like documentaries than, whatever else you would categorize some like an Ancient Aliens or a True Hollywood Story, where there is an attempt at saying something in addition to the information that's being given, and there's an attention to character, and there's I think hopefully more value to it than just being a different way to absorb trivia.
Right.
But it will always be that for some people, which is fine. It is what it is. Someone can watch an episode that we've worked so hard on to like find all of these interesting people and angles, and walk away from it saying, I already know all that stuff. And okay, that's fine. But it's for me, I think my whole thing when I approach my work is I just try to make things, if I have the opportunity to have this sort of creative control, I just try to make things that I find interesting and I find appealing, and capture them in ways that interest me, and usually that involves some humor as well. And and that's the only thing I can do, is hope that I can curate all of these interviews and moments and visuals into a sort of collection that seems somewhat different or unique. Especially thinking of like a film like Cannibal Holocaust, I think there aren't a lot of, usually when there's something about the making of that film, I think it's usually leaning into the horror, like extreme sort of, like, I just wanted to strip away a lot of the expectation that this will be like some, edgelord's wet dream or something. Like, it needs to be there needs to be, when we choose these things, a little more substance, I think.
Oh, exactly. That's exactly the right word for it. And did you sort of set out to, because that's interesting, you're not being a huge fan of Cannibal Holocaust. Did you actually set out for this season to go, what if I covered a movie I don't really like? Like, was that something that crossed your mind? Because I would think that if you're going to spend a lot of time editing something, you'd want to be a fan in a way.
No, not really. I mean, I think the film itself is, like, the actual film is not the most important part. I
Sure.
think the what's connected to the film, the legacy of the film, where the film lands in cinema history, what people think about the film, and obviously the story is connected to it, but then access to people. Ruggiero is a character.
Right.
Luca Barbareschi is a character. All of them are. So that's the most important thing. I mean, I'm not a fan of Twilight Zone the movie either.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
That's it's not a requirement, but it's definitely a different experience when I'm a fan. Like if like the Exorcist episode, being able to talk to people about that movie and meet people that were in the movie and connected to the making of it, that's a lot of fun. But it's not a requirement. It can be more interesting in many ways. But I definitely Cannibal Holocaust, it did not inspire me to like, I think I'll watch that again. Like, after having gone through all of this, with the first season, there were a couple of the movies where it was like, it'd be interesting to watch this after having talked to some of these people and been so sort of just my, everything being focused on the making of these movies. I want to watch it and see if that's changed my perception of it.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'm
sure it did.
No interest in watching Cannibal Holocaust to, see if my perception of it has changed. I don't think it has.
Well, I'm certainly hoping for Cursed Films 3, and perhaps there are stories surrounding a particular film that you and I both adore, The Gate. I doubt there are.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be a huge draw or anything.
If there were stories surrounding it, I would love to investigate them for sure. But that's the thing. I think that's the challenge with the next season is, there are lots of stories we can tell, but the audience, I think, also has to be open to expanding their own definition of the word cursed. And, maybe something isn't a horror film, but the stories connected to it feel somewhat horrific. Like, for me, the most important thing is just finding great stories and interesting interview subjects. And I think we could make a couple more seasons if there was a little more elbow room on like defining the series based on the algorithmically sensitive title of the show. But we'll see.
Could you do a slapstick comedy, right? I mean, who knows? You can branch out, beyond genre, like thinking of, because
I know some people have mentioned Snow Dogs as a cursed film, so that could be something.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I think I really do think this, like, as it went along, I felt like, man, this is getting better and better and sort of evolving. in terms of, not just your incredible talent, but just, certainly the thematic weight, and certainly like how we talked about this whole idea of reckoning with the past and tying that into both Wizard of Oz and then Cannibal Holocaust. I think that, there was a lot of thematic things going on that I thought made it even stronger. Not to say that I didn't feel that way about the first season, but there was just something more. Like, whether you intentionally did that or not, it just sort of happened, I think.
I think the first season, going into this one, we thought, okay, the first season is now the primer for how to think about the idea of a curse.
Yeah.
And, once we got through that, we didn't need to really go over that stuff again for season 2. I think you can just kind of use what we talked about and what you might have learned in season 1 and apply it critically on your own to the stories that are being told in season 2. And otherwise, just, we kind of set out to make these episodes as sort of, if not definitive, close to definitive looks at the stories connected to the making of these movies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to kind of like sum things up, to me, it's clear that you care about the stories you're telling and the people involved. And when it's over, I certainly feel like I've not only learned something, but I was thoroughly entertained and engaged, and certainly grateful for having experienced both seasons. And because, at first I'm like, oh, are these going to be glorified DVD extras or something, But no, they're fully realized short stories, short films that are presented in a way that's distinctively you. And that's, I've been a fan going all the way back to Color Not Vidente. However you say that.
You wouldn't say that to Tom Petty, would you?
Oh.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been fun. I mean, the ability to, it's been great working with Shudder on them. And I do feel like season 2, we found a good middle ground for how much we kind of dig into the supernatural side of things and how much we focus on character and story. And if we do a season 3, we have a list of films that we're kind of discussing, and
nice.
We'll see what, I mean, it'd be interesting to do something new.
That's true.
But
That's true.
I honestly, making cursed films is a lot of fun. It
seems like it. As
kind
somebody,
of ideal. It just traveling around to all of these places and talking to people about these films that, for the most part, we all love, is like getting to talk to Roger Deakins about Stalker.
Oh, that's right.
Like,
I forgot. He's
it's
amazing.
just a great gig. So I would be more than happy to do another season, even if just for my own selfish reasons, to get to travel and talk to more people and tell more cool stories.
Well, I sure hope you do. I mean, clearly, the Cursed Films trilogy, right? Things come in threes, right?
Yeah,
3
has
seasons.
to be a trilogy.
Yeah. Please, let's make that happen. And I know you got to go and record my favorite film podcast soon enough. And I'm grateful again for that's the longest running film podcast ever, isn't it? Goodness.
Apparently, according to Guinness World Records, yes.
Wow.
But it's not the highest quality or most entertaining podcast. It's the longest running, which is,
I don't think it's definitely
I guess
the
that's
most entertaining.
something.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty great. I don't know if I will be doing this for nearly as long. That's for sure. It's hard to balance it. It's like time management. I don't know how some people do it. I mean, heck, you certainly managed to keep going with Film Junk while making cursed films. And you took a couple episodes off here and there, but still, that's pretty great.
It's kind of a, there are some moments where it feels like, it's tough to fit in. Not just the episode, but watching the movies for the episode. But usually it feels like a chance to take a break
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, that's good.
you know, if I'm not traveling or if I don't have some insane deadline, I look forward to doing the show.
And I look forward to listening, and I certainly look forward to everything that you do in the future. Of course, I'm a huge fan for life, Jay. Thanks for coming on Directors Club again. Let's talk again next year if you have some free time. Cool.
For sure. Thanks, Jim.
You are a hero, a genuine hero.
You better check out Jay's incredible series, Cursed Films, over on Shudder, as well as the Film Junk podcast. And directorsclubpodcast.com, as well as directorsclubpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and stay tuned for a lot more bonus content to come.
Fuck! Like, it's so uninspired.